Record this. um, Thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk about watering and moisture and the importance of using that on your sports fields. Um, I am going to share my screen and then present that way, and we'll go from there. Hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you. All right. Okay, here we go. And like I said, I'm going to double check something real quick, make sure I'm not muted. Ready to go. Um, okay, like I said, this webinar is how to determine and apply the proper moisture or irrigation or water for your sports fields. Simple guide to proper utilization of moisture and ideal for ideal sports field surfaces. Looking forward to talking to you guys about it. It's that time of year where everything dries up and gets very hot. Okay, so my promise to you for this webinar is by the end of it, you're going to know exactly what to look for and how to properly irrigate and water your sports fields. There's a lot of different factors that go into properly irrigating and watering your sports fields. And by the end of this webinar, hopefully you've got a lot more information on how to diagnose and how to apply the water that's needed for your staff and your fields. I hope you stay with me to the end. Each one of us have very unique situations. One per person A could be 2 miles down the road from person B, and they could have very different scenarios where, depending on what type of water they're using, what their budget is, how much use their fields are getting. So if you can stay with me to the end for the question and answer session, that's always a really important part of these. I encourage you to write any of your questions on the right side of our webinar platform there. It's got a little chat box. If you could write them in there, I'll answer them either during the webinar or most likely at the end of it. I'll take some time and answer those. If you could ask some questions, I'd love to answer them for you. Get specific to your situations and your what ifs. So just a little introduction. I've been in the sports field maintenance industry for 20 years. I'm 36. This is actually my 20th year in it. Started when I was 16 years old at my local Little League. Went on to build some fields with my dad for his company. Worked at the Parks and Rec level, NCAA Division I level, and several minor league baseball levels across the country. Indiana, Kentucky, New Mexico, and 3 different stops here in Texas. So I'm fortunate that I have a lot of different experience at different levels, but also with different climates and different needs that go into the field and expectations. So it always helps me kind of bring that information to all levels, not just, the Rangers or the Astros or just one level or another, but really how you can kind of split it up between all of them. So that's a little bit of my resume and myself. What I'm going to try to get for you and what I'm going to cover in this webinar is going to be how to become an expert at utilizing. It's an important word, utilizing water for your ideal playing surface. How we're going to get there, it's going to be the different methods that you can water your fields, timing and seasonality for watering your fields and how big of an influence that is. And then the tools and technology that are available nowadays to help you water your fields. We'll go through each one of those subjects and kind of break those down as best as I can. We'll try to keep it to around a half an hour or so. Those are usually a little bit more digestible. Okay, so the first one on how we're going to get there is going to be some different methods for watering your sports fields. As you can see the pictures here, we've got a few different functions on how you can irrigate athletic fields. The 3 main ones are your in-ground irrigation. That's going to be that top picture there. This is irrigation that's ran under the ground. Usually the pipes are about 1 foot deep, and then that brings up your irrigation heads that stick right at the surface. You run a controller to those valves that allow water to go through, and then you automatically water your fields that way. That way, it's the most popular, it's the most effective and efficient. Obviously, it is a fairly expensive process, not only for water utilization, but also to install one. Sometimes those can be, if you don't already have an irrigation system installed on your field, they can run from anywhere between 20,000 and 60,000 to install one of those. So it's definitely the expensive route, but it's by far the most efficient way to water your sports fields. You can set programs for when your programs will start, how long they'll run, when they'll stop, what zones you want to run. It's very adaptable and highly recommended if you're able to do in-ground irrigation. The next kind are basically quick couplers. So it's the bottom left picture over here. It's basically the same thing as in-ground irrigation, but much smaller and much less trimmed down. You still have underground irrigation pipes, but if you have a sole quick coupler system, then you just run, for each quick coupler, there's essentially a pipe going to it. So as you can see on the top picture, where you'll have 30 to 50 heads covering a soccer field, if you're doing just quick couplers, you may only have 5 or 10. And they're really mainly only for spot treatments. They are easy to install. They are fairly inexpensive. And essentially what you do is this little Facebook looking logo key plugs into a certain fitting, and that allows you to get water to run through the hose, as you can see here. Most of the time, these are used again for spot treatments where you're watering an infield clay area, or if you have a really sloped area that always gets dried out, you can install one of these there, and that allows you water at any time to go hand water those. Again, very, very inexpensive, easy, but to water a full field like that, they become very difficult. Quick couplers are usually supplemental. So someone will have either a water wheel or an in-ground system, and then they'll add quick couplers intermittently throughout their field to kind of give them a little bit more versatility on, on the fields I would work at in Louisville, we had one behind home plate. Behind home plate, so we could water home plate. We had one behind the mound, so we could water the mound, and that's how we would also water our skin area. And then we would have ones kind of evenly spread out all throughout the outfield. So if we would get localized dry spots, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, we could go and plug in a hose and just run a hose out, water that spot for 10 minutes, and that's all we had to do. So I have seen some designs that are the whole field is a quick coupler system. That's very difficult to do efficiently and effectively. So again, that's what leads me to say that these are mainly support systems for an in-ground irrigation or a water wheel system that you already have to add a little bit more versatility. Next is the water wheel or the sprinkler system. I don't know if any of us have used one of these before. I've used several of them. They are effective but difficult. It's, as you can see there, it's a lot of times if you have a water wheel, you can just bring that that hose is attached to basically a system that'll move it back into itself, every X amount of minutes, and you run that system all the way through your field, and that sprinkler just follows the hose all the way back in. So it's still efficient and it's still effective to water a full field. It's extremely inexpensive, budget friendly, as I like to say. Down here in the bottom right, you can see they essentially have what looks to be like a quick coupler that you plug into, and then you run it to your water wheel, and that's how you water your fields. That whole system probably costs $5,000, maybe, give or take. So you can see where that's much less expensive than a full in-ground irrigation system, but it is a lot more labor intensive. So you've got to haul that wheel out there every 2, 3, 4 days if you're going to be watering, especially in the summer. It just takes longer. It doesn't shut off on its own. Some of them will, but most of them you just have to manually go shut it off. It's a lot less efficient. So you're still going to get a decent coverage, but not a full 100% coverage like an in-ground system does. Like I said, very, very budget friendly. You can do this on a field for a pretty low cost to at least get water on there and to keep fields alive. I'm sure we've all seen fields that are not irrigated at this time of year, especially here in in North Texas, but especially going further down to the West Texas and down to the South Texas areas, it just gets so hot and dry. It's very difficult to keep fields looking good and playing well without an in-ground irrigation system. But a water wheel or traveling system can help you at least get by. So those are kind of the different methods for watering your sports fields in the irrigation side of things. There's a lot of versatility to it. One side note, almost any site visit or customer that I go speak with, one of my first questions is, do you have irrigation? Because if you do not have irrigation on your sports fields, it really removes a lot of a lot of your skills and abilities that how you're going to maintain that field. You can't water or you can't fertilize as much if you don't have irrigation. You have to do all those around when the rain's going to come in, and aerating, all of that stuff really takes a toll when you cannot irrigate properly. So if you don't have irrigation on your sports fields, I would strongly recommend looking into what it would cost to at least get a water wheel or some sort of watering mechanism to water that field, because it's going to completely change how that field performs and how that field looks. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about timing and seasonality for watering your sports fields. Here in Texas, it's hot, but East Texas versus the Panhandle versus Houston versus San Antonio are all very different, and there's a handful of key attributes that you can think of when you're watering your fields, but there's no prescription. There's no one size fit all. You're going to have to customize them a little bit depending on what your fields need. But the first thing, when I was a groundskeeper, excuse me, one of my last spots was Albuquerque, New Mexico. I don't know, I was the AAA head groundskeeper there. I don't know if anyone's ever been there. Albuquerque is gorgeous, but it is a very high elevated, above sea level city that gets very hot and very dry. So this first one I'm going to talk about, deep and infrequent, that went out the window pretty much immediately. So how you want to think about irrigating or watering your sports fields is water them deeply and infrequently. Because what you're trying to do with the water is, and you can see it here in this middle picture, deep and infrequent goes to how your roots are going to grow. You can see it's not the easiest to see, but the root structure on the left of that middle picture, very dense, very spread out, very deep. That's because when you water deep and infrequent, you're pushing or you're forcing those roots to go down and get that water where you need them to go. Roots are just like anything else. If you water every single day for just a very light period of time, then your roots are just going to sit probably half an inch to an inch deep, because they don't need to work any harder than that, because they're constantly getting water to suffice them and keep them alive. So that's where deep and infrequent watering is ideal. Again, in Albuquerque, I was able to do that from the months of February to May-ish. And then when June, July, August came around, I couldn't follow that because the infrequent was too far in between, because it was just too dry. So I had to adjust that and still water deeply, but instead of watering every 4 days, I would water every 2 days, just to make sure that's the grass was healthy. And there's really no schedule for watering, and again, I'll talk about the seasonal factors here in a little bit, but, anywhere between every 2 to 4 days is quote, a general rule of thumb when it comes to irrigating. But a lot of what you're going to have to do is really look at your grass and how it's performing. You can see here on the far right picture, that's called and actually, I apologize. I want to go back to this, the deep and infrequent middle picture. So when you go deep and frequent, you can see how your roots still go pretty deep, but they're not nearly as wide and robust. Again, that's because the roots are still having to chase that water deep, but they don't have to spread out as much and more surface area to get more physical moisture. And then shallow and frequent, you can see how they're all you kind of can see they're all bunched up at the top. There's some stragglers that will go all the way down, which will happen no matter what. But you can see that root system's very high up at the top. That's going to perform very poorly when it comes to traction, or if someone's cutting, those roots aren't going to be able to to hold on or stabilize that soil, so that grass is just going to split out. So I wanted to kind of show those few pictures. Going back to localized dry spot, so that's where a lot of what I would do was, I'll talk a little bit about next, is the tracking or logging my irrigation, and I would test it that way. But I would also just visually look at how my grass is doing. You can see over here on the right, that's a localized dry spot. You can see it starts, and you can, especially if you have polarized sunglasses, you can go out, and if you let your field kind of maybe skip a watering, you can go out there and you can actually see some of these areas start to turn purple, but just before they get to this stage where, this, you can still come back from it, but this is where it starts to do damage. And that's kind of what I would base my irrigation on. I would wait as long as I could until I started seeing my grass stress just a little bit, and then I would give it a good heavy shot of water or irrigation, or pray that Mother Nature was going to help us out. But honestly, a lot of what you're going to do is just test and inspect your fields. And a lot of times localized dry spots, sometimes it's just random why it happens. Most of the time it's on a lower level, or it's on a bank, or I'm sorry, a higher level elevation, or it's on a bank somewhere where water naturally slopes off a little bit quicker. That's why it dries out. You can take a shovel and dig into one of these dry areas, and the ground is, or the soil is bone dry. I mean, it's essentially dust. So that's a great way to kind of inspect your field and see if you need more or less water. Next is going to be seasonal factors. Like I said, not only geographical factors where, Houston and Galveston, they're going to get a ton of rain. So they're going to use less irrigation, just period. But seasonal factors are the next big thing. Most people think about temperature as the number one factor, which it kind of is, but they all flow together. So humidity and cloud cover are really the two main things that affect your irrigation. Both of those things are part of what is called evapotranspiration, ET. There are certain weather apps, and I'll talk about this a little bit next section, but that will give you your evapotranspiration rates. And that's essentially how much your grass and soil, how much moisture your grass and soil is losing for that day. So a day like today here in Dallas, it's 100 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, at least last time I checked, low humidity. So we're going to have a very, very high evapotranspiration rate. That means we're going to lose a lot of moisture from our grass plants and the soil itself. So there's ways you can quantify ET rates, where basically if you have an ET rate of 20 or whatever it is, then you'll know how much moisture you need to put back in that soil and plant to get it back to where it was. But that really gets into a lot of different things. But ET rates, or evapotranspiration rates, are really important to look at and somewhat understand if you can, because that should be the driving factor of how you irrigate. The next, again, is going to be humidity. The higher humidity you have, the more moisture that's in the air, the more your grass and soil are going to hold on to that water. Same thing with cloud cover. Obviously, if it's a time of year where you have a heavy rainfall, you're not going to need as much irrigation. And then your growth habits. I see a lot of people, well, they'll just water essentially the same way the whole year. And you can really cause a lot of issues when you have an over or under watered soil and grass plant. Both can be very detrimental, and you really want to follow your growth habits. On Bermuda right now is growing like a weed. It is just hammering. I'm sure we're all mowing as much as we can on the Bermuda side right now, but it's also a very drought tolerant grass. So you can push Bermuda a lot farther without irrigation than you can other grasses. So again, following those growth habits and really seeing where you need to add those. In the spring, you need to when you first start warming up for Bermuda, you really need to make sure to give that water, because it's waking up, it's trying to grow and come out of dormancy. And in the summer, basically, you're just trying to maintain it. You don't want it to dry out too much to hurt the grass. but you don't need to just hammer it with water because it is a drought tolerant species and it's going to grow pretty well as long as it's getting a somewhat consistent um, watering. So that kind of goes into the timing and seasonality. The atmospheric factors are what should be driving your decisions. Also, with what I'll be talking about next, your watering methods. So deep and infrequent. Try to keep that in the back of your mind. Deep and infrequent when available or when you can. And then watch out for localized dry spot and always inspect your fields on how they're looking and a lot of times like this can look like a disease almost. So if you ever can, if you see something like this and you think it's dry, just take a little shovel and take a dig about 2 inches deep and see what your soil looks like. Diseased soil is going to most likely be moist. Where this, if you, like I said, if you dig into this, it's going to be very, very dry, dusty soil. So that's a good way factor to where okay, I need to add some water there. Okay, next we're going to talk about a little bit of the tools and technology to help water your fields. Like I said, there's a lot of people want the one size fit all answer for irrigation, and unfortunately, there's just not that. Everything varies quite a bit depending on, again, seasonal factors, time of year, all those things I just mentioned. But some tricks and tools that you can use that are really valuable to watering your field and maintaining and tracking moisture. So the first ones are going to be moisture meters. There's a couple, again, moisture meters and soil sensors both kind of fall into roughly the same category. They're a little different, but for all intents and purposes, we'll look them at the same. So moisture meters, basically on this bottom right picture, that's a moisture meter. There's these two little probes that you stick into the ground anywhere from 1 to 4 inches deep. And this display will usually, most of moisture meters will give you the moisture content, the salinity, so how much salts are in your soil, and then the temperature. So you can't just stick that in there and go, okay, well, I'm good. You have to kind of track and log those numbers where, after you get a heavy rain, you can go and test it and see, okay, I've got a 13.5. And after a really dry spell, you test it again and you go, okay, I got a 2.3. Well, then somewhere in between those two numbers is where you want to be. They have different ones where they're like pogo sticks. It's the same concept, but it's a physical pogo stick in the middle that you can go around and test them. Some of them are $800 to $1,000, so they're not cheap. But what I'll talk about later is the potential for water savings is pretty dramatic. So it's definitely something to look into. Another moisture meter or sensor is going to be like an in-ground one. So the one I just talked about on the right is like a portable. The one on the bottom left is going to be an in-ground. This one's a Spio, SPIIO, I think the company's called. There's several manufacturers of them out there, but essentially you dig down in the ground, you can place them 1 to 4 to 8 inches deep, however deep you want to. And that's just going to sit in there and constantly tell you the same three things: your moisture content, your salinity, and your temperature. That basically will transmit the data to a little hub that you also have to install. And then you can get that through Wi-Fi on your phone at all times. They're actually pretty slick systems. It's something, again, I would at least look into if you can. A soccer field, you may need 4 to 8 of these. And you're looking, I don't want to give numbers because I don't know exactly what they cost and I don't sell them, but you may need 4 to 8 of those sensors per field. But it's honestly, it can be money well saved if you're able to save a lot of watering and labor on those. The next thing is going to be, again, all this is going to kind of lead to efficiency. I'll give an example later of how much that builds up for water and money savings, but also environment. We've all talked, or we all know about the water shortages and how much big of a factor that plays. If you're overwatering your grasses, it can potentially be wasting a lot of water and money. So all of this kind of leads to being able to have a little bit more of an efficient irrigation system for your fields. And lastly is going to be tracking or testing. So Tracking, just like I said, if you have a moisture sensor, even if you don't, I think it's a good idea to still maybe track how much you're watering, what the fields look like on, we ran this program for 30 minutes this time and we had some standing water. So I'll drop that down, or we did it for 10 minutes and we dried out really quickly. So tracking is a really important part. Just these moisture meters and sensors just make that a little easier, obviously with a cost to that. But then up here at the top, it's kind of a stretched picture. But another thing that we all should be doing, and I would do at almost every place I went, was an irrigation audit. So when I was in San Antonio, since that's such a hot, dry climate, I did an irrigation audit as soon as I got there. Basically, what an irrigation audit is I would go around and you would set up these little catch cups. There's tons of different varieties. You can do shallow, deep, whatever you want to do, however it makes most sense for you. And you essentially just place them out, you space them out evenly, and you run an irrigation zone. You run your irrigation program as normal. You can run it quicker, or you can run each zone at just like 5 minutes. But I always like to just run your normal zone, so that gives you exact data on how much you're putting down. And that's going to tell you where, if these cups over here on the left are getting less water than these cups on the right, well, then your irrigation system isn't set up properly, or your head is too high or low, or you don't have the right nozzle, or something's going on there. It's a very cheap, inexpensive way to do that, or way to test that. And I recommend doing that every field, every couple years, just to make sure, because irrigation gets moved around and bumped and all that. So irrigation audits, if you've never done one, I highly recommend them. They're very easy to do. You just get like 20 of these cups. You can go online and find some of them, and just go out there and see, how much a discrepancy is between your fields. And a lot of times if there's cups that are getting a lot more or a lot less water, I can almost guarantee you're having turf issues or grass issues in those areas, where if it's too dry, you're probably drying out much quicker. If it's too wet, you may have compaction issues or even disease issues, because that area is staying wetter. So all three of those things are different tools and technologies that you can use to monitor and track and test your irrigation and your water and moisture that you're putting on your fields. Please look into them. Some are more expensive than others, but they're all very well worth it if you're able to afford them. Okay, now I kind of wanted to talk about a couple things that questions or pushback that I always get when I kind of start talking about these things. And one is, what if I don't have the time to monitor my irrigation and monitor the efficiency? And obviously, I completely understand that. I worked at a very large Parks and Rec organization here, and this is actually a picture of it here in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and we had a short staff and a lot of fields. But hopefully, if you can follow the information in this webinar, that provides you a little bit more efficiency just off the bat, but also prioritize your fields and focus on the main sites. Monitor the fields monitor your water, and track and test your water on your showcase and highest used soccer fields, and just kind of do it that way. And then once you get that down, then you can move onto the other fields and expand how you're monitoring those. Another easy way to do it, again, it's not the most accurate, but it's just pure looks. Like, just go out there and kind of look at your fields and see what they're kind of telling you, dig down. And, that's why pocket knives are always a nice thing. I'd just dig down and cut a little, 2x2 square, 2x2x2 square cube deep. I'll check the soil, go, okay, that's super saturated, or it's really dry. And that's a quick, easy way, cheap way to check and monitor your moisture as well. And then also compare. Trial and error is your best friend. Let's say if you're looking at this picture, the 4 closest fields to us, let's say we wanted to monitor those, and then all of a sudden they look fantastic. And, over here, we change up our irrigation times to a little less or a little more, and we start getting issues there. Well, again, that's a really easy way to track and monitor your irrigation system. Again, not the most accurate, but it's a way that you can, if you are on a time constraint, you just don't have the manpower or the staff or the budget to monitor the efficiency of your irrigation. Those are little ways that you can kind of get around the system and kind of allow for more efficiency by prioritizing, really just looking at your showcase fields and then comparing your on-site fields that you have. Okay, next is the one I always get is I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't have the knowledge and skills. Well, again, hopefully if you're able to follow the information in this webinar, that's going to tell you the when, the why, and how you should be watering. And also throughout my 20 years, don't be afraid to ask others. I've been one of the biggest advocates of networking and peer-to-peer sharing because we all go, and you can see shared misery. Misery loves company. But we all are going through roughly the same stuff. And I highly recommend reaching out to other cities, other school districts, other professionals, universities, whatever your levels you're at, and use the people around you and see. If you live in Austin, let's say, well, talk to the people in Temple or Killeen and say, hey, how often are you watering your fields and for how long? And if they're, because you're going to have roughly the same climate, and if they're double the amount of time you're doing, well, then, there may be something there. Or if they're half the time you're doing, then there may be something there. So just something to please ask others. It's a great resource. Peers are a great resource. And you're likely going to make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. Please do. I've made more mistakes than I can count in my 20 years, and I only consider a mistake if you don't learn from them. So trial and error, try different things, run your system a little longer, overwater it, underwater it, and see what your fields, not to the point that you kill it, but just so you can get some sample sizes, sample data on how efficient your system is and how much water your fields do need. And the next, be kind to Mother Nature. However, your way of showing Mother Nature you love and appreciate her, keep doing that, because ultimately she's the main reason for it all. If we can get a fairly cool, wet spring, summer, and fall, then our fields are going to look as good as they ever have. If we get a hot, dry seasons, then we're going to have a lot of issues. So be kind to her. The last question I always get is, what if I don't have the budget? Again, perfectly understandable. One second. Excuse me. So lastly, and again, follow the information in this webinar. The process of how you use and utilize your water and moisture is more important than your price or your budget. So if you have a really small budget, you can only water at certain times, make sure your process for watering is exactly where you need it to be. And that's going to kind of take care of that situation just on its own. Next is water savings. Whenever it comes to budget and irrigation, I always try to put kind of a slide like this together just because it illustrates really effectively how important this can be. So these are all pretty conservative numbers. This is just a general soccer field. So let's say if you're putting about a half of an inch of water per week on one standard size soccer field, you're using about 30,000 gallons of water for that week. Half of an inch isn't all that much. I mean, that's about the bare minimum that you want to be doing. Next, so if we multiply that, because you're not putting that much on it for 52 weeks a year, but here in Texas, you're probably getting a good 40 weeks, 8-9 months where you're watering that much. That's 1.2 million gallons of water for just that one soccer field per year. If you're able to save 5% on your irrigation, you're saving 60,000 gallons of water. Obviously, I don't know everybody's situation, but how much do you pay for water? If you pay whatever, obviously you don't pay $1 a gallon, but if you paid $1 a gallon, you're saving $60,000 just in saving 5% of how much you water. So that's a really easy way to, if you're able to monitor, test, and track your irrigation and your watering to where you're doing it efficiently, I guarantee you're going to have savings, and you can quantify that based on kind of some of these numbers and then ultimately what you pay for water. So if you don't have a big budget, 2 things to focus on is process. Make sure your process and your utilization of your moisture and water for your fields is great. and then also think about water savings and how you can you can quantifiably check what some of your savings can be. All right, there we go. 35 minutes, pretty close. So again, this was kind of this webinar covered how to determine and apply the proper moisture for your sports fields. Some of the main topics we covered were different methods for watering, which included in-ground systems, quick couplers, water wheels, and transport systems or traveling systems. Timing and seasonality for water, deep and infrequent. Try to remember that. Seasonal factors, and then things like localized dry spot and physical visual tells that your grass is telling you. Also, tools and technology, moisture meters, soil sensors, tracking and testing, all very, very important things that can really lead to a lot of savings and improved field conditions. I did want to say that I was going to add infield clay onto watering infield clay onto this webinar, but as you can see, even without it, it was a 35-minute webinar, and there's actually a lot that goes into that. So that's why I didn't add it in there. You can go to sportsfieldsolutions.com. So we're Sportsfield Solutions, and this is everything we do. But you can go to sportsfieldsolutions.com, and we have some videos there that explain how to water infield clays. We've actually also done a webinar on infield clay maintenance, which had a big part of moisture on there. Excuse me. So if that's something that you want to have sent to you, then respond to that email that we sent out, and we can get that webinar sent over to you, and you can watch the recording of that. So again, we're Sportsfield Solutions. We do construction, renovation, full maintenance. We have a full line of materials, including infield clays and Diamond Pro distributor, and we do landscape and irrigation installation and maintenance. Thank you again so much for the time. I'm going to go back to I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the webinar homepage and see if we got any questions in the chat. Stop sharing. Okay. All right. Looks like I appreciate all you guys' time very much. Thank you so much.